Did you know that Henry VII, the first Tudor king, was as graceful as a three-legged horse on roller skates? Yes, you heard it right, folks. Our dear Henry, the beacon of royalty, had a knack for making an entrance, but not the kind you might expect. Imagine this: a young Henry, all decked out in his royal finery, gearing up for his grand parade. The crowd is ecstatic, the trumpets are blaring, and there he is, about to make his royal descent. But instead of a majestic trot down the parade route, Henry takes a tumble. A royal, full-blown, head-over-heels tumble into a muddy ditch. Now picture this: a royal figure covered head to toe in mud, trying to maintain a regal stance. It's like watching a penguin trying to do a pirouette. It's hilariously pitiful, but you've got to give it to him for trying. The tale of the muddy misstep is one of my favorites, not just for its humor, but for its humanity. It reminds us that even those destined for greatness can have their less than graceful moments. And boy, did Henry have his. The best part, though, despite being covered in mud, Henry didn't lose his royal cool. He stood up, dusted himself off, or rather tried to wipe off the mud, and continued with his parade like nothing happened. Talk about keeping a stiff upper lip. It was a muddy day indeed, but it was also a day that marked the beginning of Henry's journey to kingship. A journey that was filled with more comedic missteps than a slapstick comedy show. And just like that, our dear Henry, the beacon of royalty, became the symbol of royal clumsiness. A symbol that would last through centuries, reminding us all that even kings can have their oops moments. And that, my friends, was Henry VII's first step towards becoming the king, a muddy, not-so-royal misstep. Henry VII's love life was more complicated than a Sunday crossword puzzle. Can you imagine juggling not just one, but multiple relationships while wearing a cumbersome crown and a cape? Well, that was the life of our dear King Henry VII. His love life was like an episode of The Real Housewives of the Tudor era, without the designer handbags and Botox. Let's start with the main lady in his life, Elizabeth of York. She was the white queen to his red king, the yin to his yang, the cheese to his macaroni. Their marriage was a political move to unify the warring houses of Lancaster and York, but they did have 7 children together, so there must have been some sparks flying in the royal bedchamber. But hold on to your horses, because here's where things get juicy. Rumor has it our King Henry was not a one-woman man. His royal eye was known to wander, especially towards a certain lady-in-waiting named Jane Popincourt. Jane was French, vivacious, and, well, not his wife. It's said Henry showered her with gifts and attention. Naughty, naughty Henry. And then there was Catherine Gordon, a Scottish princess, who was allegedly another object of Henry's affections. Whether there was any truth to these rumors, we'll never know for sure. But it does add a little spice to the otherwise bland pot of Tudor history, doesn't it? So, was it a love triangle, or a love square, or maybe even a love dodecahedron with Henry VII? It seems anything was possible. In his defense, though, it must have been tough being king. The pressure, the politics, the endless banquets with questionable medieval cuisine, and maybe his tangled love life was his way of escaping the mundane monotony of monarchy. Who knows? So, in the end, Henry's heart was a kingdom with a few too many queens. But hey, that's just another day in the life of a Tudor king. Scene script. Henry VII was the King of England and the king of penny pinching. Now you may think that kings and queens are all about fur coats, diamond-studded crowns, and gold-plated thrones, but not our Henry, no siree. He was more of a thrifty kind of guy. And by thrifty, I mean he probably would have given your bargain-hunting grandma a run for her money. There are tales you see of good old Henry counting every single penny. Literally, he was known to sit in the royal treasury, surrounded by mountains of gold and silver, counting each coin one by one. It was his favorite pastime, some say. Others say it was his only pastime. I mean, who needs jousting tournaments and grand feasts when you can count coins? Am I right? But that's not all. Henry's reluctance to part with his hard-earned, or should I say, hard-taxed money, extended to all corners of his kingdom. Royal luxuries? Who needs them? Henry was more of a bread and water kind of guy. If he could have worn sackcloth and called it a day, he probably would have. But alas, even he had to keep up some appearances. Imagine this, you're a guest at King Henry's castle. You're expecting a grand feast with roasted boars and goblets of wine. Instead, you get stale bread and watered-down ale. And for entertainment, Henry counting his coins. Talk about a royal letdown. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with being frugal. It's just, well, when you're the King of England, people expect a little more, you know? A little more pizzazz, a little more extravagance. Not a king who'd probably haggle over the price of a chicken at the local market. So remember, the next time you feel guilty about splurging on that expensive latte, at least you're not King Henry VII. Henry VII was a brave king. Well, except when it came to cats and dogs and birds. Yes, folks, our man Henry was a bundle of nerves wrapped in a royal robe. He ruled over England, but his fears ruled over him, imagine. A king afraid of kittens. It's like Superman being afraid of a sewing needle. Now, we're not making fun of phobias here. Well, maybe just a little. So picture this, the mighty Henry VII, sitting on his throne, trembling at the sight of a tiny bird fluttering in the castle. He'd probably scream, "Off with its wings! Yeah, not so tough now, are you, Henry?" And it wasn't just animals. This guy was afraid of the dark. No, not metaphorically, as in he feared the unknown. Literally, he was afraid of the dark. Bedtime must have been a real hoot in the royal chambers. More candles, I can still see shadows. But wait, there's more. His Majesty was also a bit picky with his food. And by picky, I mean he was terrified of certain foods. Picture the royal banquet, a table groaning under the weight of the finest foods in the land. And there's Henry, poking at his plate with a scepter, asking, "Is there onion in this?" I can't eat onion. It makes me anxious. It's one thing to rule a country, but it's another to rule your own fears. But hey, we all have our quirks, right? It's just that most of us don't have to deal with them while wearing a crown. But let's give the guy some credit. Despite his fears, he did manage to hold on to his throne, his kingdom, and his sanity, mostly. Maybe he was onto something. Maybe being afraid of everything is the secret to ruling a country. So in the grand scheme of things, Henry VII was a king who was king of, well, his fears. In conclusion, Henry VII was quite the character. A king who wore the crown, yet stumbled over his own royal robes. He was more likely to trip on the red carpet than walk down it with any semblance of regality. Let's take a minute to recap the royal missteps of our dear Henry. Remember the love triangle, or was it a square? Even a Rubik's Cube would be less complicated than Henry's love life. He flitted from one romance to another like a butterfly with commitment issues. I mean, who knew that a king could also be the star of a medieval soap opera? And then there was his frugality. Henry was a king who would rather count his pennies than his kingdoms. He was more of a royal accountant than a monarch, always with his nose buried in spreadsheets rather than royal decrees. He probably knew the price of every loaf of bread in his kingdom, yet couldn't remember the names of half his courtiers. But what truly sets Henry apart was his fear. A king who was more scared of his own shadow than any invading army. He was the kind of monarch who would probably have hidden under his royal bed at the first sign of trouble, leaving his knights to do all the fighting. Just imagine if Henry had been a bit more kingly, how different history might have been. Perhaps he would have been a fearless leader, a passionate lover, and a lavish spender. But then he wouldn't have been our Henry, would he? The king who made us laugh more than any court jester ever could? Henry VII was a paradox, a king who was more of a commoner in his heart. He was a royal who didn't quite fit the royal mold, a monarch who was, in many ways, just like us. And that's why we love him, despite or perhaps because of his many quirks. And there you have it, the life and times of Henry VII, a king who was truly a jester at heart.